So welcome to our Comac Webinar series. Comac is a UK and South Africa network focused on strengthening community-based voices in the design of digital interventions for maternal and child health and well-being. And so the purpose of this webinar is to gather up voices from our network and from our network of contacts and have conversations really about different approaches that we can take to this problem of digital maternal and child health. And we're inviting everyone from researchers and practitioners to any other stakeholders we think would be useful to hear from and really discuss this problem and to learn from, to help us to really frame what we're doing. And so Nervo has organized for us a set of speakers to really talk about methods for research in this space and creative approaches to doing research with mothers and community members in a number of different contexts. So I'm really excited to hear from all of these speakers, and I hope we can take from this some ideas for how we're going to proceed forward with future research with mothers and children and parents. Great. Okay. Go ahead, Nervo.
Okay, so today we're going to have three different speakers. We have Daumanai from Cardiff University, Naveen Bagalkar from the Sister School of Arts, Science and Technology from India, and Teresa Almeida from Umeå University in Sweden. So while I just try to stop sharing and while Dawn is sharing her presentation, I will just introduce her. So Dawn is a reader in social science, psychology, and her research interests revolve around class, education, gender, geography, identity, and inequality. She has been using a lot of participatory, visual, and creative methods in her work with the communities. So today, Dawn is going to make a short presentation. So it will be around every presentation around 10 minutes. And you can use the question answering feature or just the chat for any question during the presentation. And we can have a discussion later on when everybody can reply the questions. Okay, Dawn. I guess you can put it in presentation mode.
I can't, it never works. I'm just you've got a little preview on the side of what I'm doing. When I do that, it always goes funny. So sorry, you've got the little squares as well. So thank you, Melissa and Nervo, for inviting me today. It's really nice to be with you all. And the first slide, I just wanted to say it's nice to speak with people from a range of disciplines and different outlooks and different perspectives and different research. So I think when we come together from different disciplines, we can do really good research and think about other people's perspectives from looking through all those multiple windows. So I'm just going to talk to you about some work that I've done with parents. I use visual research and I've used it for quite a long time, creative approaches in my own work. But I'm just going to talk to you about three particular studies. So in this study that I did with Amy Grant and Ruby Marzella, we were interested in infant feeding. So we were interested in mothers' choices in terms to infant feeding, and we wanted to talk to both mothers and grandmothers. So we did interviews with new mothers who just had a baby and their mothers. And we asked them to bring objects. So we know that objects tell us a lot about people's lives because they've been used for years in disciplines like archaeology. And Rachel Hurdley, who studied people's mantelpieces and display units in houses, talks about how narratives tell you something about both the person and the wider community. So in this study, we didn't want to ask new mothers to make collages or take lots of photographs because they were new mothers and they were busy. So we just asked people to bring objects that they thought represented their experience. So these objects are containers of meaning, so participants are already invested in them in some way, but they don't have a huge time commitment from participants to make something or do something. They just bring things they already own. So because it was around infant feeding, as you can imagine, we had the sort of pictures you'd expect to see, like breast pumps and bottles and shawls. But because the object task was so open, we were able to think about things in different ways, and people led the research in different directions. It also gave us access to people's homes. So often people would do a walking tour around the home and show us baby wardrobes or the new baby cot. So it gave us more insight into their everyday lives. And you can see there's a picture of two mugs. And somebody brought those objects to represent something not that had happened after the baby was born, but that had happened in their pregnancy. So the new mother and the new grandmother had gone for a cream tea in a posh hotel when the mother was pregnant to have a sort of celebration. And when they got there, the waiter told them that they couldn't have prawns, they couldn't have cream cheese, they couldn't have salmon. They had to have cheese and pickle sandwiches on their tray. And they both had to have the same so they wouldn't share. So it was this policing of the pregnant body by others. And mothers started to talk about it's not just infant feeding where they feel judged, but also right throughout the pregnancy. So outside observers would comment and police their behaviour before the baby was even born. So because of this, we then did a number of other projects that focus more, not just on infant feeding, but on the pregnancy itself. We were also interested in the ways in which motherhood is viewed and how that's related to other things like age and class. So we were interested in this sort of moral maze of motherhood. One of the things we did here was look at found images. So when we're doing research projects, we often look at books and articles and we look at the text about what's gone before to tell us something. But here we looked at images. So we did searches and we looked for mother and baby images. And then we put in other search strings such as young mother and baby, teenage mother and baby, council estate mother and baby. So what we found was that there are very different tropes in the images. So for the mother and baby pictures, you can see you get these mainly advertising images, which are sanitized. So it's just the mother and baby and a blank background symbolizing that nothing else is as important as the maternal relationship. As soon as you add in some of the other strings, you get these demonized versions of motherhood. So you get the semiotic signifiers of smoking or drinking, or you get graffiti in the background, but you also get a lot of other more subtle things. So if you measure the distance between the mother and baby photos, between mother and baby, it's much smaller than if you measure the distance in those more demonized images. So it tells you a lot about how particular types of mothers and motherhood are represented in the media. With these images, we then use them in a photo elicitation exercise with mothers, and they could recognize the ways in which the mother and baby photos were very much a false image of what motherhood's like, but at the same time, one that they were expected to live up to. So there was this impossibility of being this type of ideal mother. And even though they thought it was fake, they felt that other people judged them on that. So the mothers felt that these type of images tried to classify mothers like them into this sort of type of otherhood, this type of not good enough mother. The other study I wanted to talk to you about was, again, with Amy Grant and colleagues. And we were thinking about the whole journey into motherhood and what happens after the baby's born. So the first thing we asked mothers to do was these timelines. So you can see the timeline picture in the corner. So we asked mothers just to talk about their whole lives, really, leading up to motherhood. And we used emotion stickers because when you're doing interviews, or if you're a participant, it can be really annoying when someone keeps saying, And how did that feel? And tell me how that felt. And how did that feel? So the emotion stickers provide an opportunity for the mothers to annotate their timelines in relation to how they felt at those times. We also asked mothers to make collages and complete word bubble activities. And then we went back and revisited them. And in the last revisit, we did sandboxing. So you can see in the corner of the screen, there's a blue box filled with sand, and we've got about 200 little figures, animals, trees, bottles, all sorts of things. With the sandboxing, this was a joint activity. So all the researchers involved in the data production had had children. So the researcher had a sandbox on the participant, and they reflected on motherhood in that box and then had a conversation about both boxes. What was really useful with this approach was that we had that biographical information about the mothers. So you can see in that box, there's lions and tigers, and a couple of mothers use lions and tigers to talk about how they'd have to protect the baby. And then when you went back to their timelines, you could see how this aligned with how they'd been bullied as children in their own lives and this need to protect. One mother didn't use the figures at all. She just had the sand and wrote one word in it, and she just wrote the word complete, which sounds like she didn't really engage with the activity, but the word was really poignant because the mother had had several miscarriages and been in an abusive relationship. So that word complete, that having that baby, being pregnant and having the baby, that word summed it all up for her. That's what it felt like. So that was really useful in terms of opening it up to have that biographical perspective, to understand the mother's histories, the mother's communities, the mother's experiences. It was also useful doing the joint activities. We thought that the sort of instructions and things were quite clear, but some of the mothers had issues with literacy. So even though they'd done the timelines and the collages alone, they said it would have been better if we did all the activities together. They really enjoyed doing the sandboxing because we did it as well. So that was a sort of note to take forward about, do you ask people to do things alone? Do you ask people to do things together? How do you provide instructions? And what is clear for one participant might not be clear for another participant. So those worked well. Sandboxing together also was useful to build trust with mothers. So some of the mothers wouldn't want to talk about things that are demonized, like drinking in pregnancy or smoking. Where they were paired with a researcher who had those conversations, they felt like they could talk about those things that you're not supposed to talk about. So we found differences. We also found differences in their first interview when participants said that they didn't smoke at all. In their second interview, the person who'd interviewed them had gone on maternity leave, and they were paired with somebody else who did talk about smoking in pregnancy. And then they said that they had. So it also makes a difference who's doing the interview and how the participants see them. The last thing I wanted to say is, so these aren't projects about infant feeding or motherhood, but I've been doing some projects during COVID, and I was very worried that projects would sort of get closed down and there wouldn't be space to do anything creative. But in these two projects, one with children in foster care and one with care leavers, we've managed to do creative things online. So we've posted out crafts, activities, and children have made them and photographed them and showed them to us online and had really good discussions about them. And with the care leavers, we left it open so people could send poetry, photographs, make models, however they wanted to interpret the questions. And you can see here that someone's made a model of COVID and how it looms over their locality. So even though things are online doesn't mean that it closes down creativity. We just have to think about different ways to be creative. So hopefully that was about 10 minutes. So thank you very much for listening. And I'll look forward to the next presentations and the discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. Exactly.
Thank you.
So Naveen, if you can share your slides, I will introduce you. If there are any questions, you can use the chat or the question answering for down, and then we can have the discussion later on. There are so many nice things aligned to what we have been doing with Naveen as well. So the second speaker is Naveen Bagalkot from the System Institute for Arts and Design and Technology in Bangalore in India. He is a senior researcher in human-computer interaction and experience design. He has been working for a long time with NGO partners in India, such as Maya Health, using a lot of participatory and collaborative digital fabrication and different design methods in order to inquire and engage with the community. And he's also a very good friend of mine. So Naveen, you can start.
Thanks, Navo. I thought that introduction itself took almost 8 minutes of the 10 minutes that I have. Yeah, it's very awkward when, academic introductions. Okay, with that, on that note, I'm going to talk about creative methods that we have used in participatory research. And I'm going to talk about the case study that at Nervo and I, and along with a lot of others have worked on. The work continues, but I'm not going to talk about how it's continuing now in COVID situations. Yeah, thanks. So I'll quickly move on. Okay. So this work is actually funded by the MRC and AHRC Public Health Partnership, along with Leicester, Srishti, and Dobro University. And the focus was exploring what were the pregnancy care experiences, both from pregnant women and their communities, as well as the healthcare infrastructure in the community health sector in India, but we focused on a particular case, and we worked closely with Maya, which is a not-for-profit organization which trains women health workers, community health workers, to offer sort of management of chronic and long-term conditions for the community members. And the work that I'm going to present now is mostly the sort of ingenuity and creativity of Zainab, Swati, Anushree, and Harita, who have worked on this project at research associate levels. And so just a shout out to them. So this is something that I'll quickly gloss over. Basically, this is a broader structure of public healthcare in India, in Karnataka and elsewhere too. So there is primary health centers, which is small clinics with the doctors and nurses. But there are a lot of voluntary workers, ASHA workers, who go door to door, as well as we have the private and not-for-profit enterprises like the Maya, who have health navigators, and who also do door-to-door work. So it is in that context that we started looking at and understanding what pregnancy experiences happen. The frontline health workers, ASHA workers, and the health navigators are their education is between anywhere from 10th to 12th grade to degree holders. So they do know reading and writing, but English is a challenge. Kannada is the language that works. So maybe a quick video will show you all a glimpse of what we did. And as this video is playing, maybe I'll So we did about 27 interviews of pregnant women and about 6 focus groups of various health workers, including ASHA workers, Anganwadi workers, and we used a lot of creative methods, and I'll briefly show what those methods are. This is just to give a glimpse of research. So what you see here is a center of that Maya has in Chenpatna, which I'll explain in a bit. And the women are the health navigators. About 10 of them worked on this project as co-researchers, defining what should be the research agenda and methods, as well as analysis of the findings. Right. So moving on. So I'm just going to give you a very broad overview of the methods that we used, just kind of name dropping. We did day in a life as well as a pregnancy journey mapping. And these were methods, which is on the top, where it was used as a prop when interviewing the pregnant women. So as the narration happened, the research associates as well as the health navigators drew and annotated it. And also there were other methods such as asking the ASHA workers about their day life and then asking them to write it down, imagining possible futures using postcards and written down. So sort of the health navigators imagining their own role in pregnancy care. We also used some typical sort of service design methods, which is mapping the scenario and use cases, and using them further to engage with the frontline health workers as well as community members. We used also the observations and the stories that came from the interviews. We further used them to pose questions and evoke ideas with the health navigators, who then we designed a kit and then use that kit again to use as an enactment with the pregnant women to foresee and sort of speculate possible futures. I'm not going to go into detail about these methods as such, but what is interesting when Nervo asked me to think about this was, for me, what role did these methods play in our research? So. And this is just from a half a day of thinking about this, and so this is quite raw. But I think and this is of course a lot of conversations with Nervo too, and I think what role did they play were they categorizing it broadly into four things, but this is work in progress. It could be many other things too, but they enabled participation, particularly of the health workers that we worked with in the co-production of knowledge. It enabled. The methods enable the health navigators to imagine and practice as researchers and not just as data collectors. And I'll elaborate how. This is something I guess is quite well established in research, is about how making information that you collect visible makes it easy for validation and verification with the participants. I think what is more interesting was also about how these creative methods made visible for us and the research team, as well as the other stakeholders, some labors, emotional labors of pregnancy journeys, as well as the labors that go into maintaining the health infrastructure by the frontline health workers. And in a most sort of mainstream participatory design, they also played a role to evoke desirable. So based on time, I'll first focus on the first and the third point, and then if you have more time, we can go into the other two. So, so enabling participation, I mean, this is just an example. This was a session where the team of health navigators who expressed interest in participating in this research as researchers. And this was the meeting that workshop rather that decided the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And the methods that we used were actually mapping the locality in a very hand-drawn map and identifying where what kind of pregnant women live, and then that provoked a discussion and a lot, and that making that information visible helped a lot of the health workers to articulate what they think should be the inclusion or exclusion criteria. And it also gave them the sort of a space to articulate and take ownership of the process itself. It continued, and this is from one of the health navigator who actually drew and wrote down a day in a life of one of the pregnant women when we were interviewing them. So the interviews always happened with research assistants as well as one health navigator of the community, and they also mapped this as part of data collection efforts. So they could also articulate, and there's a lot of things that they could bring forward that we couldn't, because even though Chenpatna is about 70 kilometers from where I live in Bangalore, that's a huge distance in India in many different ways. What we also did was map the sort of the pregnancy journeys across the sort of infrastructure that I shared in before. So there's a primary health center, then there are these door-to-door health service, health volunteers, ASHA workers who are coming to you. Then there's a sort of a community health center, THC in the town, but it doesn't have enough resources, so you have to go to private clinic and all that. So the navigation becomes very important, and this emerged when we started mapping the pregnancy journey. And this is of one case that was which a person who had complications, including anemia and diabetes, gestational diabetes. What happened is when we were mapping this, also it became very easier for the participants to correct the information and add and annotate. So that's, I guess, is very quite prevalent. But what is interesting was it also became for us a sort of a case, a very specific case of how pregnancy journeys can be very laborious, not only in terms of physical labor, but in terms of emotional labor of a pregnant woman. So this map we then converted into a storyboard, which became a sort of I would say a lead storyboard, and something that we always fell back on, and we still do whenever we're talking about pregnancy care journeys. And we further use this in sort of working with the frontline health workers to validate, verify, and how these information and the navigation flows happen. So which is what you see here. So this is an image where we take this scenario and we also map onto that. Oh, I've already crossed 1 minute. Okay, so this will be my last slide. So where we map onto the scenarios and workflows of the frontline health workers and make them these cards, and we ask the frontline health workers. So the person sitting here is a nurse, and there are these ASHA workers there in the black to validate and verify. But what came about was other instances of labors that the ASHA workers and the frontline health workers do, which otherwise we couldn't find. For example, when there was a serious case of pregnancy that was not recorded, and the family was not around to take care, and how the ASHA worker had to step in, stay with the pregnant woman at the district hospital 40 kilometers away for 3 days to make sure that they get the care at the tertiary care center. So again, so the act of making it visible, mapping it, and making and involving people through that, what helped was the labors that go into maintaining the infrastructures became visible to us. I'll skip this part because I've already. So again, to summarize, I mostly talked about what role the creative methods played in our research around mapping pregnancy care experiences at communities level. And this was mostly the work that I talk about is from Zainab, Swati, Anushree, and Harita, but we all can then further circle back and maybe we'll have a good discussion around this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Naveen. So while Teresa is sharing her slides, there are many questions in the chat. We will go back to that. So Teresa is a design researcher working in human-computer interaction and exploring the critical feminist health and woman-centered methodological approaches in design. She also works in feminist theory and trying to contribute to social science as critical to advances the quality and equity in technology design. Teresa, you can share your screen. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. Yes, so I'll pick up on a few things that were mentioned in the previous two talks, actually, but I will focus my presentation on actually one study with 2 different workshops. It's a small body of research that, let me just change something here. It's actually developed and extended from a master thesis that I supervised back in 2019 when I was at the IT University in Copenhagen. So this all happened prior to COVID, and you will see that the workshops I'm gonna talk about, they're very much dependent on a physical space. But this was a thesis by Ida Kilius-Svenningsson, and the title at the time, well, the title of the thesis is Exploring Potential for Supportive Environments to Empower Women in Pregnancy. And we continued working together to reflect a little bit more and to write a little bit more. And you see below we have these two publications that came out of it. But it's a research exploring creative methods for having discussions on topics that might be a little bit sensitive, and also to help with designing interactions. And it is a study, I have all these, a study looking at emotions in pregnancy, the emotional labor, and inquiring on how we can explore this powerful facet of pregnancy that is still rather unexplored or limited when it comes to design and technology. And I'm talking here from the field of human-computer interaction design, and while looking at literature and work available in that field of research specifically. So overall, the aim was to understand how to design future systems and tools that can support pregnant women in embracing their emotions and empowering them in using emotions for personal strength at a time in which they are transitioning into parenthood, to motherhood. The study overall includes observations in yoga class, plus interviews with 2 midwives and 1 doula, but here I'll focus on the 2 design workshops only. And I'll say that the empirical work was centered around a small sample of women living in Copenhagen in Denmark, all of which have access to healthcare and economic opportunities to acquire support through private antenatal courses. So this to acknowledge that factors such as socioeconomic, cultural might vary deeply, and the emphasis we have put on the practice of yoga that also can be understood differently. And the empirical work was conducted by Ida. Okay, so just going back to what pregnancy is, it is an emotionally overwhelming transition into motherhood. The physical and psychological challenges, including a wide range from weight gain, edema, discomfort, aches, mood instability, all of which overall affect pregnant women's well-being. It also involves well-established societal demands, not least that of being or becoming a good parent. And these challenges and demands during the different stages of pregnancy can lead to maternal stress, which then in turn has a lot of negative consequences for the development of the fetus, or can leave the pregnant women especially vulnerable to emotional stress. And of course, we all know that there's a plethora of digital technologies, a proliferation of technologies that have provided the tools to navigate these different stages of pregnancy and support some of these concerns. So self-tracking technology is very popular, widely available on the market, focusing on a variety of solution-driven approaches to anything from nutrition to exercise, all the way to community sharing or more accessible communication with healthcare professionals, for example, and very broadly speaking. But then we were asking, or we were interested in asking on how, so if the physical body, which can be intensely tracked through these technologies, is gaining so much attention, what happens to the emotions, what we call the emotional body? So yes, we went back to look at the literature in our field, look at how it looked at prenatal care, the significance of emotions during this time, and also consider the practice of yoga as a tool to support those who are pregnant. And we narrowed down the focus a little bit to consider how to put forward emotional pregnancy, that which accounts for the psychological and mental reactions to the transitional experiences towards motherhood, becoming a parent. And that comes with emotional challenges, emotional changes. There are plenty, and we do have all kinds of health applications used as preventative tools and devices and self-tracking and monitoring technologies. But then what else? So focusing now on the creative aspects of this research in terms of how we designed workshops that invited groups of women to be active participants in. And the first one was what was called the Individual Pregnancy Exploratory Workshop, which was a 2-hour workshop with a group of 5 pregnant women, age range 25 to 31. So also all pregnant for the very first time and in heteronormative relationships. So the workshop aimed to inquire about their life, how they feel, and how they the different behaviors involved in their daily life since becoming pregnant. So it was exploratory in nature, divided into parts. So initially it was designed around conversations among the 5, and then it was followed with a hands-on design-oriented activity in which they had different craft hand tools to think with. And we wanted them to be actively engaged and think through ideas and concepts on how to improve these experiences of pregnancy. So these are some questions that were asked. Here we did ask, and we asked them to then have a conversation around it. So questions such as, what are the major concerns in your pregnancy? What's your biggest source of support? Again, to gain insights into their everyday lives and reasoning, to then understand what could be improved and what works well, what works less well. And they described the use of mobile applications, of course. This was also something that all of them brought in with them to the workshop. As I didn't mention before, one of the things that was asked of them was to bring something that they thought was significant in their day-to-day experience of being pregnant, and they all brought a mobile application. So from mobile applications to their interactions with their partners, healthcare professionals, friends and families, their fears, strengths, how they obtained information. So I won't read the quotes, but you see there that there's already some themes that were emerging around how the body changes and different aspects of feeling lonely. So in the second part, it was all around this hands-on activity where they used colored pencils, clay, glue, paper, Post-it notes. And this was all about opening up for conversations around the situations and their biggest concerns. So they suggested activities around community building for pregnant women to come together. They suggest an app for resting and promoting serenity that could help the pregnant women in slowing down during their pregnancy. They discussed pain. They conceptualized the vest with heat features for pain relief, and a teddy to stimulate the senses with smells and light for the room to remain calm during labor. So these are some ideas they share that relate to the comments they had made earlier. And it all came up more consistently while working on their sketches and discussing together and reflecting and moving a little bit forward. So these interventions were really responses around some of the main concerns during the pregnancy, and also for when the time comes when giving birth. So on the one hand, the challenges of the body changing, both in its physicality and sense of pain, are major concerns. Then on the other hand, emotional concerns such as not being able to do the same things as before pregnancy, the experience of loneliness, being alone with the worrying. So and all of this might happen at the same time as the body is changing. So all in all, they acknowledged that community building and sharing information with other women was helpful for them to feel empowered in their pregnancy, and understood that taking responsibility in pregnancy would lead to improved pregnancy and birthing experiences. And I'll emphasize here that this all came up in conversations while sketching out, sharing ideas, cutting paper, drawing on paper, so being creative overall. So with this exploratory workshop, we took the main themes, main ideas, and continued exploring some of these concerns. And we mapped them out around these three main categories around bodily changes, addressing the challenge of oh, no. I'll have to speed up then. So bodily changes, responsibility, and loneliness. And we designed a second workshop around these more sensory-based kind of environment setting. And this one was more focused on the prenatal yoga setting. If I haven't mentioned before, now I forget, but DIDA, who was doing the thesis, she's actually a very experienced prenatal yoga teacher. So this was actually one of the main reasons for doing this study to start with, or where the interest also came from. So this was a 2 hours yoga session with 3 women, aged 29 to 34, at different stages in their pregnancy, first time pregnant, heteronormative relationships, one experienced yogi, one had just started to attend prenatal yoga classes, and this was the one participant that actually had joined the previous workshop and then continued through, and one wasn't engaged at all. And I can also mention how difficult it was actually to recruit participants for such a study, because as weeks go by, in terms of pregnancy, things evolve very fast. So if someone agrees to participate in the studies in 2 weeks, then who knows what might happen. So there was some difficulty in terms of recruitment. But back to the creative part of it. So this was a workshop divided into 3 parts, according to those 3 themes. In a yoga studio in Copenhagen, the room was well prepared in advance with all kinds of props, arranged in a circle with a space for each of the participants with the props and a focus on a safe space. And then in the center, you see there in the picture, there was a kind of a prototype in the shape of a lamp with an adjustable light bulb and a built-in recording device and speaker. And there was a toolkit for each one of them that combined a journal and some writing materials and affirmations overall, which I'll cover next. In saying that this workshop again was divided into there were 2 different components to it, including the yoga practice, selected complementing postures, and the environmental lighting would change depending on which affirmation they were going through. I'll speed up a little bit and I'll show you what it means, these affirmations. So affirmations springing from Self-Affirmation Theory, which introduces a responsive practice with regard to threatening information towards one's personal beliefs. And in this study, these affirmations were designed, or they were created around short positive sentences, which are used to empower the pregnant woman's conception of the self. And these were based on their concerns, on some observations, their insecurities, and DIDA, as an experienced prenatal yoga teacher, created them. So you see the first one related to bodily changes, and how I allow the changes in my body to open up for bodily explorations, to connect with my baby. So in terms of light and environment, this was a semi-dimmed light. And the affirmations were recited in the group and recorded so that they later could listen to them collectively. So this happened with all the 3 affirmations. I'll show you the second affirmation around the concept of responsibility. And in here, the light would have changed into a brighter light to emphasize strength. And a final one around the notion of loneliness and deserving to taking support and be deserving of the people around us. And in this case, the light was dimmed again, a more cave-like setting, the idea of creating a safe environment with a very dimmed light. And I need to stop. So very quickly, these are some of the reflections from the women. I won't cover that, but I just want to say that with this research, we understand the importance of self-tracking technologies and how they can bring power to or empowerment to one's pregnancy when access to professional support is limited. But we want to stress the emotional well-being, not by distancing from self-tracking technologies, but to think with technology, exploring yoga, the combination of these movements, light, sound, affirmations, and understand how women respond to stimuli beyond the screen. So overall, reflecting on how using creative methods to reflect on emotional pregnancy and how this can actually lead to better pregnancy and birth experiences. And I'll end here.
Thank you, Teresa. If there is anybody who has questions, that you can use the chat. I know Melissa has a lot of questions and she can just ask them directly.
So thank you guys so much for all of these, like this window into your methods and what they are able to achieve. And I think just thinking about creative methods and what they are is, I've been trying to think, are creative methods that are unusual, or creative methods that like engender creativity? And I think it's more of that latter. And I think of like generative methods. And so I really like Naveen's kind of breakdown of it, where like these methods enable co-production, they enable people to kind of add and annotate and cross-verify, right? Like not like moving beyond triangulation where you're doing lots and lots of measures, but allowing kind of the interactivity and that feedback on what's being generated. And that ability to make the non-visible visible, like the things that people don't necessarily say in an interview can actually become much more tangible and apparent, using different ways to approach people, different ways to build empathy, and providing them different ways to convey ideas. I put in a few questions in the chat. So a lot of this was note taking for myself, so I wouldn't forget what questions I wanted to ask. So can you talk about how you would modify sandboxing and other methods in a COVID-19 context, or if maybe like it's better to postpone this kind of generative activity till after COVID-19? And so I think that's a question that's open to all the panelists, but we can start with Dawn and kind of.
Yeah, I think sandboxing is probably the one that is the one that you can't do. One of my PhD students wants to do sandboxing because you can't really post all the stuff out. The sand's heavy, there's lots of figures. Everything, most other things that I do, you can do. So in those studies, we posted out stone painting kits. So people have painted stones and they've had particular themes. You can do fuzzy felts. We've got something where you make an aeroplane. We've got bottle decorating. But in all those things, it's not just the making. There's a side activity. So I was saying in the text box earlier, but not to everyone because I did it on the wrong button. That when we did the make your own drinks bottle, we did a message in a bottle activity where people vote a message to someone who'd find it in another country. So they're tied in with activities. So I think you can definitely do it online. It worked much, much better than I thought because I'm used to doing it face to face. But the children with those activities really engaged. They also made their own activities that weren't in the packs. They've suggested things for the next 2 stages of the project. So yeah, it worked really well. And what worked really well with the project with children in foster care was that we would have done this in workshops. So foster carers would have been excluded, but the foster carers found that they got to know the children in different ways, better than they'd known them before. So they said it's something that they should get when new children come to build relationships and have a more nuanced understanding of each other. So they worked really well in that way.
Great. Naveen, did you have any thoughts on, like, because you have a lot of sketching, does that like how does that play out in COVID, and kind of like what were some of the ways that you felt worked to build empathy when you worked with participants remotely? I guess that goes to anyone who's managed to do remote.
Oh yeah, that's so we are actually continuing the work with the health navigators with Maya right now. Partly because we have a small grant from Cardiff to work with them to design a data infrastructure for community health. But we have moved to COVID response now, because the second wave is now moving to the rural parts of India. So the health navigators, along with Maya, are trying to work with the government, the public health system, to help their communities to deal with COVID. And the particular focus with Maya is to try to reduce the burden on the public health, like the tertiary hospitals, and see if we can help people isolate safely within communities. And just to give an example of, I don't know if it is really creative, and we are actually struggling, and Siddhant, who is working with me on that, is an audience. The challenge is also, even though Chenpatna is about 70 kilometers away from here, not every of the health navigator has a smartphone. So sending information task, it's not only the language barrier, but it's also about technology barrier. And then it has to be meaningful for them to do this. We asked them to. We began with trying to map the local resources that is available, and that was through WhatsApp. We sent out some sort of a very simple questions in Kannada, but the coordinators who are on the ground had to call each. They have made circles of the health navigators, so they had to do a sort of a phone call and ask them, and they have written these down into small notes, and they take images of that, and then they send it back through this WhatsApp channel. And those who don't have smartphones use smartphones of their relatives, friends, families. So it adds on to a lot more work behind this scene on both sides. And now we're trying to see how we can map the experiences, more qualitative experiences of the community with related to COVID and their concerns and anxieties. And that's something that the tricky bit now that we're working on is, how do we convert, let's say, a simple sort of COVID journey, or similar to pregnancy journey, but something that can be done, one health navigator, maybe with 2 to 3 people in the community, draw it out. And will that work better, or will an oral narration work better? We don't know. We'll have to try that out. But these are the added challenges, I think. Yeah.
Just going to pick up on something else you said, Melissa. I think the thing I like about creative methods is the time for reflection. So if you just go in and do an interview with a list of questions, the participant's got to give you an instant answer. But if they're involved in making something, they're thinking about the topic for a longer time. So it makes the familiar strange for the participants, because they get to think about their lives in a deeper way. And picking up on Naveen's point, we have the exact same problem with people don't have smartphones, don't have Wi-Fi, can't afford the credit. So when we work with care leavers, we did a lot of things just on the phone when we actually phoned and talked to them. But I think posting things out is quite nice, because people receive things through the post. So I think the postal service, like we all think about email and online, but if you can't meet up with people, having those tangible things that you can touch through the post is really nice.
Lots of, anyways, I have like 14 questions in 14 different directions to ask you. But I'm going to try and stay moderately on topic. I think, so we've been thinking about a lot of different kinds of generative methods for our next community engagement. And looking at design cards, and I remember seeing like lots of objects for people to work with. I'm pretty sure some of that was food and snacks for people to eat, but like in Teresa's pictures, but there's pens and pencils, but there's also, what I liked in Naveen's pictures was that it wasn't just design cards, but they were like 3D objects that people could handle. I'm not sure if it was like cheesecloth or what, but they were like foam board or something, right? And I think I have this fear that we're going to post things out and people are gonna be like, I don't know what to do with it. And then I have this other like vision that when we post things, or when we bring our own supplies to the table that are like very traditional Post-it notes and permanent markers and stuff like that, that we set up design as something that can only happen with these specialized tools. And so there's two questions here. One is like, how can we design toolkits or maybe lists of ideas or whatever that will enable people to recognize their own design capacity without needing special supplies that are actually hard for them to acquire. And this other thing, do they like, will they actually design? Will they really engage when you post them something? Like, I'm afraid that we'll work this really hard to produce something, and when it comes time to interact, they'll be like, and I think that's part of my question about like, how do they feel about pen and paper versus using kits for design? Because I know people can be very intimidated if you ask them to draw something, and the idea behind the design cards is to like get over that like fear of drawing bad stick figures. So anybody, I'd love your experience and comments and reflections.
I think people like to do things that they can keep and have a use. So if you're working with mothers, that something like they could build a box to keep baby things in, or they could build a scrapbook that they could then show the baby later. So I think people like tangible things that they can keep. I think lots of adults often don't like drawing. I love drawing. That's not, I don't love drawing for me, but I love it when people draw, because you get really reflexive accounts, but you can't make them draw. So lots of people don't like to draw, but they can collage and do other things. I think there's stone painting and sort of kits again, so you can personalize things and keep them for you or give them as gifts to somebody else. So a lot of children with the stone kits, you have, like 10 of them. So there were some for them, some for the project, some for friends, some for, so yeah, so if it's got some sort of value, I think people like getting engaged.
The first lockdown activity I did with my kids was getting a bunch of stones and painting them. Took over the living room for a week.
And if you can get stones, it's only the paint, so it's not too, cost heavy then for the project. And you get pens as well, so if people don't want to paint, you can get the pens that draw straight onto the stone.
Okay, so the other point that Melissa, you mentioned about how I have experience, along with Maya, working with health workers, both within this project but also elsewhere, that a lot of time the toolkits that we take to are quite intimidating, and it works in two ways. As one is there is not participation as we expected. The other is there's an implicit assumption that we impose that this is how creative design happens, we have been fortunate that the health navigators have been pushing back on the second part, so I'm not talking about the extended community, but just the health workers that we work with. They were quite hesitant to draw when this was the first project in 2016, and then we had to figure out multiple ways, and then they really posed, why should we draw? Aren't there any other ways that we are creative? And then what turns out that in the tradition of participatory action research in India, especially in grassroots level, they do a lot of enactment, street theater and enactment and role playing. And we tried that method, and that worked like a charm, because they were used to it. They've been trained in those methods, and it's something that it's very easy for them, as opposed to me and my design students who are stuck up with inanimate drawing, whereas they're all animated and using props and acting. So So there's been a lot of learning about what is creative methods when it comes to participatory action research, and I think it's a lot of trial and error. And as long as we have people on board who also see a value in why we are doing it, and then if we can get that to that level, I think then the media doesn't really matter. It just emerges. So the toolkit, for example, is something that emerged between constant conversation between Swati, Zainab, Anushree, Harita, which is a research design team, as well as the health workers on the ground. So they did like 5 trips and 5 workshops and just to design the kit, and then 3 trying out, and they were used as enactments, as props in an enactment. So there were thermocol boards with each representing sort of a value or a service or a product or a technology or an emotion, and those were also decided with the health workers, and what goes on there, what size, and all that. And then so that, I think that even in the design, the participation becomes an important point.
I can just add to that, just to say that even in the project I showed very quickly, I think in bringing something like Post-its, for example, and asking people to sketch as part of a group, in the end, we end up with 0 sketches. But what happens is that there's an environment and people come together and they have a space to talk that otherwise would be there, perhaps, but would be very different. So as long as people don't feel like they really have to draw anything, but they see it as an opportunity, then it works really nicely.
A follow-up question, I forgot. Go ahead, Nerva, what do you?
No, I was reading the comments. So yeah, I have seen also people using music or dancing or cooking, depending of the cultural settings. So for example, in the Peruvian project, I have seen that some of the people in the health centers, in order to show the mothers how they have like a cooking demonstration, how to make the foods. But that's difficult right now. But then I know they are making now, they can send the videos through WhatsApp, so they can get it through it. I just, Naveen, remember for the project that we have in the north part of India, there were mothers and also the sister who were doing drawing, right?
Yeah.
How confident they felt when they were doing the drawings of the navigation.
I think there it worked, and this is I don't know, this is just my understanding that because they were a part of a rural spaces in and they have a rich tradition of drawing and painting their homes as part of a culture. And there's a wedding, so there's a whole sort of study that Lakshmi Murthy has done, who was a collaborator there, and it's way more stronger visually as a culture than a written, and that's why I think it was much more easier for them to getting drawing. But this is just a feeling. I've not really dug deeper into that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was something about, like Dawn was saying before, like when you're doing the interviews, sometimes people are not able to actually articulate something immediately. And just having this visual representation helped them to not only to show, but also to speak out. Yeah. For example, the things about the emotional concerns, and the feelings of policing. So that was really interesting to see. Is there any other questions from the audience, apart from Elisa, with many questions?
I think in our own work, we've used skits and other things as generative activities. So it doesn't always have to be like drawing and storyboarding, but like even like creative oral practices might be good for rural African contexts. So just thinking through some of that. I know we're running out of time, but I have these 2 other questions. I don't know if we'll have time to actually answer them. One is, to what extent are any of these generative activities gendered, like whether guys are more likely to, create and collage versus mothers. And if we can design, how do we design kits that are kind of appealing to a range of personality types and expectations around creativity. The other question that I like want on the table, and we don't have to answer it now, but like, is to what extent does use of creative design techniques, creative methods require training of the HCI researcher employing them? Or what does it take? Because I think in our work we have, a few HCI researchers, but the people actually doing the engagements with individuals are not trained HCI researchers. And so what do we need to do to help, help non-HCI trained researchers facilitate creative methods?
I think you can practice with your friends and family, which is what I did before I went out in the field. And if I have a new technique, I get friends or family, victims, as I like to call them. And then, so I get to trial, you can trial everything. And I think training you can do online. There's online stuff. I've got workshops that I did that are recorded online. I'd always be happy to have, a Zoom with someone if they just wanted to talk through the process. So I think if you talk to other researchers and you trial things, that's sufficient training. Just trying things out first and speaking to other people. You don't necessarily have to do like a week course in. You just have to be good with people, really. I think to work with people.
Co-Design Academy. I'm telling you, we need to develop our Co-Design Academy.
You can bring down Naveen and Teresa to South Africa.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it is useful though if you do have. Often, if I do workshops and they're face to face, you can do it there and then, which is nice and gives people more confidence. But if you can't, I think there's ways around it. If you need to quick check.
So I guess there are no more questions. Any more questions, Toshka? Since I can just recognize one name now. Oh no, Sarah is there as well.
I just had a really quick response to someone else, Melissa. Adults, I found that they'll just engage. A lot of children have really strong gendered ideas. So as much as you try and be gender neutral, they won't have it. They've got very clear ideas that that's a boy's thing and they're not doing it, or that's a girl's thing and I'm not doing it. So if you're working with children, with the children I work with, tell me off all the time about it not being the right thing and that I'm a boy or I'm a girl. So yeah, you do get a lot of that with younger children.
Yeah, I guess Teresa and Naveen are thinking about it.
I can just add to the gender thing, just from experience from another project and a conversation I had a while ago. I have this work with a toolkit for pelvic fitness, and it's based on a certain anatomy, right? So it was designed for the non-female reproductive organs, female anatomy. And I had a conversation a while ago with someone who was interested in designing something to be deployed with men, because he's been doing some yoga related work with men that have some kind of dysfunction. And he was telling me that because my toolkit is all around textiles and cutting and sewing textiles, he was saying that won't work. It has to be more of a toolbox, like something that they can hammer, that they can, because they already come to him with in such a vulnerable state, because having a sexual dysfunction makes them very vulnerable. And just the fact that they have to admit to it, or that they go to these workshops. And but again, it's based on this fixed notion of what gender is, and depends on the context. In different contexts, different reactions and different expectations.
Yeah, I guess from the work that we have done in India with Naveen and also with the initial community interviews, we noticed that parents or the fathers are not very related to pregnancy, and so it's something that we can explore as well, right? How to engage with the fathers through creative methods. if they are interested to.
Yeah, I think that's going to be tricky, but important to do that.
Yeah.
One of my students tried, but yeah, he couldn't really get through. It's quite tough.
You need to get a hammer.
No, the topic of pregnancy, I mean, of course, it's a very limited sort of sample size to even claim any generalization, but people that he could talk to were quite not forthcoming to even talk about pregnancy, saying that that's something that my wife will deal with or my mother will deal with. You know, I have work to do. Sort of that, but of course, yeah, it is a student-led project, but we need to sit and dig deeper into that.
Yeah, that's another thing, right? If you are going to talk to men, the researcher, yeah, and it's the same with the women, right? She'll be a female researcher who is more has empathy. Yeah. I guess we run out of time already. If there are no any other questions, any other comments from the panelists or from Melissa, should we just close?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much to all the panelists and for your talks. It was really great. And join us for our next webinar in about a month's time on, I think, other approaches to communication that aren't necessarily internet for maternal and child health digital interventions.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you very much for coming and speaking to us. It has been a very nice and diverse sort of presentation. And I think I met Kat, and she told me before about the samples, but now I saw a picture. So it was really nice to see what she was telling me before and how it worked. And we can just stay all afternoon talking about this, but we don't.